in the 2010 general election, you delivered a shock result against the DUP leader and MP for over 30 years, Peter Robinson. You had obviously been working, in that constituency for a number of years. Can you say with all honesty that you expected to win in 2010, or was it as much a shock to you as it was for the pundits?
We knew when we started to canvass that something was happening on the doorsteps. You could tell there was a momentum starting to build, but we expected at the start of the campaign to come second. That was our ambition in some ways. In the previous general elections, we'd always been third, and we thought if we can overtake the Ulster Unionists, there's a real opportunity for us the next time. So, I mean, it wasn't that we hadn't thought about the possibility, but we weren't necessarily expecting it in that election. But we did know once we started talking to people, and this is where canvassing becomes so critical, because we started to realise there's something happening. And we could tell that there was a change in the atmosphere. People had become very jaded. There was a lot of scandal in politics at the time. People had become very frustrated. I was Lord Mayor of Belfast and had been having quite a positive term in office, and had been working the constituency really hard, for the last number of years. And I think there was just a momentum that started to build, and it became very much, and I think Peter Robinson actually partly tried to frame it as a two-horse race between myself and him, because he thought it would help him, because he thought it would split the vote with the Ulster Unionists, and that I wouldn't get enough to get in, but that they wouldn't get enough to beat him either. But it didn't pay off, because
I mean, it's clear, Naomi, that you've been building support, and you can look at the stats there through the elections through the 2010s in that constituency, and people don't vote for people unless they support them and believe in them. I wonder though, you increase your vote share by a massive 25%. How much of that, and there clearly is some of it to be put down to the allegations of financial corruption and the kind of tawdry revelations about the Robinson family. How much, if you had to put a percentage, is people believed in Naomi and the Alliance Project, and how much of it is people were just not happy with the kind of scandals that were happening in politics?
Well, I think Peter losing the seat was down, I think, a lot to him and this everything that was going on around him. But me winning it was down to Alliance. So it's not as simple as saying that everything was about that, because the natural successor would have been an Ulster Unionist candidate to take him out. So the fact that we overtook the Ulster Unionists and beat the DUP, you can't say that just happened because he was in a bad way. There were reasons why people chose to bypass the Ulster Unionist candidate, a good candidate too, Trevor Ringland. I mean, he wasn't a bad candidate at all, but they bypassed him and came and voted for me. So I think you've got to give credit to the party and to what we were doing in East Belfast at the time, as well as recognising that, yes, I mean, some of the lack of interest people had in him definitely was spawned by his lack of interest in the constituency, the scandal, the other stuff that was going on. But it wasn't all that. That wouldn't have delivered a win for me. That would have delivered him losing the seat to whoever his main rival was. And at that time, very clearly, people thought it was the Ulster Unionists.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. You were then in the House of Commons for 5 years until 2015. When a unionist pact did help to oust you in 2015. Did you like the House of Commons?
I did. I really enjoyed it. I hated getting there and getting home. It was awful. The traveling was punishing, but I really enjoyed the work. And I found things that, it's like any place, there's a massive amount of work that goes on, a lot of speed to what happens. So I found the things that really mattered to me, and I focused on those. I was on the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee. I was also very involved in work around religious freedom and human rights. I was engaged in a lot of work around women and girls, around international development, and then as well as the kind of traditional Northern Ireland stuff that we've been involved in. There's obviously that stuff around welfare reform was really live when I was there, because that bill was going through. So there was a lot of meat to get stuck into.
There's some people that we've spoken to, I think particularly from the devolved nations and regions, who really don't like Westminster. They go, why am I going down? There's kind of, or you get people who go, I liked being, there and able to influence things in that way. I mean, did you prefer it to the Northern Ireland Assembly, for example?
It's really hard to say. I suppose if I had to pick one that I thought was more rewarding, I would say my time in Belfast City Council, bizarrely, was one of the most rewarding, because you make a decision one month and it's implemented the next month. So there's an immediacy to what you do. Someone comes to you with a problem, you can get it fixed. When you start to do parliamentary work, you're talking about legislation, you're talking about shaping things in a much longer term, and it can be quite frustrating. Between the Assembly and Westminster, I mean, Westminster is a kind of place apart. It's a very unusual place to be in many ways. I didn't really get sucked into the culture of it as such, but I enjoyed the work and I enjoyed what I was doing, and I had a good team around me. The Assembly can be frustrating. It really can. I was in Westminster in an odd time because we had a coalition government. So I was the only Liberal in opposition because every other Liberal was in government. And I'm glad I wasn't, I have to say. It was just...
Were there ever discussions, alliances affiliated with the Lib Dems? Were there ever discussions about you being in coalition? Or maybe...
Actually, at one stage, there was a discussion about a rainbow coalition when the initial elections came in, and I had phone calls from the Conservatives and I had phone calls also from Labour, and Labour were trying to build a rainbow coalition, including the Liberal Democrats, the Greens Alliance, and I said, look, this is not going to hold for 5 years, and actually I think the country needs stability. And I don't think it will hold, but there were discussions that happened. I just don't think I could have gone into government with the Conservatives. I looked at their agenda and their policies and where they were headed, and to me, they just didn't sit comfortably with me as a Liberal person. I don't think that they are sensitive to Northern Ireland issues in the way that I would like them to be, and I wouldn't have been comfortable in that. I understand, actually, and I kind of respect why the Lib Dems did what they did going into government, because, I mean, when we had the choice here in the Northern Ireland Assembly at the start of this mandate, we went in largely to try to create stability. So I do understand that motivation. But for me as an individual from Alliance, I felt that I could make a better and more valuable contribution actually as an opposition MP, free to speak out and to do what I wanted to do rather than be guided around policy from the government.
There's an interesting dichotomy there, Naomi. I wonder, I mean, on one hand, you're saying you thought the country needed stability, and on the other hand, you're saying you didn't want to see the Tories in power. Why then were you adverse to that rainbow coalition that the Labour Party were putting forward?
I wasn't averse to it. I just didn't feel it would hold. And in the end, they reached the same conclusion. It would have required the DUP, it would have required the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the whole gamut to be on board. It was literally going to take every single vote in the House. And at that stage, I just felt, given the nature of politics, what you could have ended up with are very small minority interests actually having undue influence over general policy. And I think that there's a danger when that happens. We've seen it with the DUP when they were kind of the tail that wagged the Tory dog for a while over Brexit. It's not a healthy situation. And even if you agree with the people who are doing it at the time, there'll come another time when the group of people who have that level of influence are using it for purposes that aren't appropriate. So I was nervous about a huge
amount of power, I suppose, in that. I mean,
I was nervous about it. I didn't reject it out of hand, but it never came about. But there were a lot of conversations about whether it would happen. But I was nervous about it because I genuinely was fearful that what we would end up with is a government that kind of stumbled along maybe for a year, maybe a year and a half, and collapsed. And I've been through enough messy collapses of government in Northern Ireland, frankly, to last me a lifetime. I actually think a 5-year term government is a good thing. I think a bit of stability in government is a good thing. I think one of the areas, obviously I didn't particularly want the coalition, but having seen what the Conservative Party is like when it isn't in coalition, I much preferred the coalition to what we have at the moment. But from my point of view, as I say, when I was contacted by Labour, I said to them I was up to have the conversation, but that I was concerned that we might end up in a very unstable position. And I do worry about the impact that has on the country in terms of business and economy and all the other things. So
who contacted you before we move on?
There were a couple of people from Labour, Sean Woodward and a few others. He had been the Secretary of State at in the kind of outgoing time. I'd spoken to some people further up the food chain who had also been asking about this and who were testing the water. But it was one of those it was one of those prospects that I think there were a lot of people in Labour who just did not want the Conservatives in government, understandably. But I think realism dawned that they were the largest party and therefore had to be given a chance to form a government. And I think the Lib Dems in the end were the ones who said that they couldn't see that they could get a deal with Labour that was going to actually hold for a full term. But I certainly wasn't going to consider going into coalition with the Conservative Party because I wouldn't have had any influence. Actually, I had more influence working on the opposition benches. But what I was able to do from the opposition benches was build good relationships with the team that were there on the front bench at the time, and actually get some things delivered, which matters. Because I think, you know, you've got to be able to use your power wherever you have it, whether it's soft power or whether you're actually in government.